I think a good place to start today, what's on my mind today, is the notion of freedom. I mean, if you said to me, what do I think is the most important thing to experience in the world as a human being, I would say freedom. And I'm not associating that with anything political, religious, spiritual, or anything like that, just freedom. You know, when you see animals running around, you see children running around, they don't know anything about the meaning of the word freedom, it's just simply freedom. To me, the universe, the nature and creative people, basically, they're in a condition of freedom, I would say. So I've always associated my own first experience of what is called enlightenment, although I didn't know anything about enlightenment. That was really a sense I felt to be in a free state. I felt I was I was free. And I had no associations to that. It was just something happened to me, and it wasn't even considered to be a state of mind. I didn't know what it was. You know, you're walking along and suddenly the sun comes out and you're looking around, you feel happy. You know, maybe something just sparks it off. You know, you're suddenly listening to music and you feel happy. Well, it was like that, and it's never gone away. I just felt, you know, literally, suddenly I was free. I can't tell you what time of day it was or anything that specific. I can tell you the year, 1968, but I can't actually record it in any linear time. It just happened. It's the same way when you see a UFO, it just comes and it goes. And most things in consciousness come and go. You feel good, you feel bad. You read a book, you stop reading a book, you go for a walk, you come back home. You have a feeling of euphoria and that goes away. But this freedom hasn't gone away. And it's something in itself. It's not about anything. It's not freedom from consciousness, or like Krishnamurti says in his book, freedom from the known. It's not freedom from thought. It's not freedom from knowledge. It just happened. It just happened. And they say that in Zen Buddhism, that moments of satori, emptiness, enlightenment, they just happen. And they come and go, but mine actually stayed. But I'm not saying for 50 plus years I go around being conscious of being in satori. It's not like that. It's really nothing to do with your consciousness. So even if I can describe it with my consciousness, and I've kept a journal and described what it's like day by day by day, that's only a description of consciousness. That has nothing to do with the actual reality of enlightenment, the reality of freedom. So I disagree with Krishnamurti in the sense that it's freedom from something. I mean, the Buddhists use the term liberation, and the idea is liberation from the human condition. That's basically what it means. It was seen as very limited, very tragic, and illusory, you know, a kind of self-deception. So it's really in the sense of Maya, the veil of illusion, it was freedom from self-deception. Now, because what we know about Tibetan Buddhism was written by all kinds of different people, and we know nothing about what the Buddha actually experienced, then when they say the psyche, consciousness, is an illusion, in one sense, they are saying that knowledge isn't wisdom, consciousness isn't enlightenment, isn't nirvana. But they may not be saying literally that everything in the psyche is unreal, or even that everything in the physical universe is unreal. I happen to think that everything in the physical universe is real, and it's not a projection of the psyche, it's not a virtual reality, it's not produced by consciousness. Now, there are people that say consciousness is synonymous with the quantum field or the unified field theory. Therefore, consciousness is producing reality in terms of consciousness, the psyche, the physical universe, the multi-universe. I don't go along with that. I think the physical universe is perfectly all right on its own. And if you're a scientist and you're an atheist and you're not interested in the psyche, you're not interested in spiritual things, then I think, carry on doing your investigation. If that's what they want to do, whether I agree or disagree. I mean, they carry on doing their investigations into technology, super intelligent machines, non-local travel through the universe, colonization of other planetary systems, and there's nothing's going to stop them probably, and they're just going to go on, and they may evolve or develop into a kind of different kind of entity. They may no longer be human beings and almost like invent their own system of consciousness and personality and reality. So I think in the sense of the physical universe is infinite, and therefore by implication there are infinite galaxies, and then if there are infinite universes and infinite dimensions of the psyche, and even you might say infinite dimensions beyond that, I think that since the physical universe here is billions of years old, and there's likely intelligent beings on other planets that are millions of years ahead of us in terms of consciousness studies and technology and science and religion. Who knows what's out there? But it is a physical universe. It's going to go on infinitely, and there's no reason to kind of reduce it to consciousness or reduce it to anything. And then you've got the psyche, and there's a lot of parapsychological research, but nothing that's really substantial, in the sense you can't say where the psyche is. So when you go into a dream, you can't actually specify in relationship to the body and the physical universe. You can't actually say where it is. And there are people that say there are all kinds of dimensions all around us. So when I see these apparitions in the house, they must be very close, they must be right here, must be very close here. And I don't just see like ghostly things, I see all kinds of people that look like they were, I'm not saying how real they are in terms of how we're real, and then we can dream something which is like a figment of the imagination, so to speak. But then again, Jung and other people think that in the land of the dead, in the other world as it were, that's where our ancestors are, and living in the psyche. But what I'm saying is that if you take the physical universe is real in itself and doesn't need to be interfered with ideas of consciousness and all of that, and then you take the psychical world as real, say it's real, and you can go in there, and then you take the spiritual dimension as real. So in actual fact, in Tibetan literature, they actually refer to nirvana as reality. For them, nirvana's reality. And then they also say that when the Buddha went into reality, as it were, his Buddha essence, his individuality, then he was in a state of liberation and freedom. And because nirvana is emptiness, then that freedom has no specifications, is not reducible to psychic conditions and physical conditions. Therefore, you can't begin to measure it, and probably never will be able to measure it. And it's also synonymous with eternity. So you have an infinite universe, possibly an infinite psyche, and then an eternal spiritual dimension. And it's eternal because it's empty, it's nothing. So if you have a physical universe that's infinite, you could say it's a universe of infinite conditions, and you have a psychic universe of conditions. But the point of freedom and nirvana is that there are no conditions. So it's just a radically different kind of reality. I mean, if you imagine fish in the water, and then insects flying about, and monkeys climbing trees, and human beings living in houses, they're all different layers of reality, you could say, and they're not necessarily understood one by the other. So the insect doesn't know about the fish, and the fish don't know about the monkeys, and the monkeys know very little about us, actually. So we know very little about where Buddha went, and we know very little about apparitions and people that may have died and entities that might live in the psyche. We know very little about it. And you could say also that in the realm of the physical universe and the psychic universe, everything is relative to the kind of thing you experience. Everything has a context, like a dream or a vision, or you meet people in particular conditions and contexts. Whereas if you go to nirvana, there is no context. There is no relationship. There is no obvious structure. And I think that's probably why the Buddha, when he was asked, what's it like in nirvana, and he refused to give any kind of metaphysical concept or metaphysical description. And then Lao Tzu says, those who know do not tell, those who tell do not know. Because if you try to put it into words and say, oh, well, nirvana's like this and this and this, it's just not possible. I don't know why, but it seems not to be. But in my experience of enlightenment, in the immanent sense, not the transcendent sense, but in an embodied sense here, there's no way I could describe it other than emptiness. So you might say, my experience of emptiness is an experience of freedom, so that when I'm kind of walking around, you might say, if I'm in that state, then it's a state of non-identification. I don't need to be anybody. So if I'm walking by the river, to myself, I'm nobody. I'm not, to other people, I'm a person walking by the river, but to me, in my psyche, in my consciousness, I don't have any specific identity. I mean, I remember where I live, I remember, I'm in England and things, but very seldom do I ever think that I'm in England. I mean, I don't take in any of the media, I don't know what's going on in politics, I don't know what's going on in society at all, and I never have. I've never been kind of open to all of that and the news and newspapers and all that stuff. So I've never had any idea. I mean, for years and years, I didn't even know what the President of the United States looked like, or the Prime Minister of England, for years and years. And I had no idea about celebrities or anything like that. So that state of freedom allows me to disidentify with myself as an English person, myself even with an interest in spirituality. So when I'm walking around, I'm not thinking, I'm a spiritual person in Enlightenment and I'm an English person, I speak the English language or something like that. I don't have to think about that. But of course, as soon as someone calls over, somebody says hello and wants to talk to me, then of course I can just kind of switch into the consciousness mode and have a conversation. But as soon as it ends, it just switches off. They say that there's a thing called peak experience, which was developed by someone called Maslow, I think American, and I think from that was developed transpersonal psychology. So the basic idea is, in terms of consciousness and psychic abilities, you can be playing the piano. So you play the piano and you play it every day. You're a musician and you enjoy the music. You play in the band or you play in the concert hall or something. You're enjoying the music day by day. But once in a while, I think, that people are playing the music and then they say they're in another level. And that other level is like a peak experience. They go outside of themselves, as they say. This is their description of it. It's as if they're above their body, looking at themselves playing, a kind of out of the body, altered state. And so for a moment, or however long it lasts, they're not the pianist. They're not who they think they are. They're looking from a different perspective. Now, you could say, if their identification is the person sitting at the piano, and then they sense themselves in a transpersonal way, what is the identity of the person observing themselves? What is the identity? Because I'm saying that it's still within consciousness, and consciousness is predicated on identity. So you're in the waking state, you go to sleep, but you're still yourself. You still have an identity. You're still the same self. And most of the dream is about your daily life, and you recognize things in the dream. Or you're on an astral travel, but you still have your identity. You still come back and you have the same identity. Now I'm saying in enlightenment, the whole process of identity stops because there is no consciousness as we know it. It's not a field of identification. So I'm wondering, in the idea of the peak experience, it's a kind of simulation. It's almost a simulation of enlightenment. And I think there's probably people actually think it is enlightenment. That I'm not sure how, in transpersonal psychology, I think there's lots of interpretations, as there is in all fields of culture. It's all about interpretation. If you have an experience, you interpret it, you put it in a context. So I'm saying that people in transpersonal psychology, people that study altered states, people that meditate, people that cultivate higher levels of consciousness, that kind of thing. I think that, you know, they may scale that in terms of freedom, and then you have freedom from the other state. So you're in one state and there's freedom from that state. So you're in the state of playing the piano, and then you have a freedom from that. And I think the idea is that peak experience, that kind of freedom, is holistic. So it's as if you're experiencing the music, the phenomenon of yourself playing the music, the phenomenon of your consciousness experiencing the music. You experience that in a very heightened sense, holistic sense almost. And when people describe it, I mean, they really like being in that state, they want to be in that state. And of course, then they start cultivating it. You can go to different things in transpersonal psychology. I mean, it's a therapeutic system as well. And of course, that's what people do. They like it and they cultivate it. They like reading people's minds, they like astral traveling, they like this, they like that. And they cultivate it in temples, in ashrams. I mean, all over the world, for thousands of years, people have cultivated, just like when we go to university, you cultivate music, you cultivate science, you cultivate the study of religion, etc., etc. So there's all relative degrees of freedom from something. But the idea that there's a freedom in and of itself which isn't reducible, isn't something you can talk about. Now, if I say that freedom is enlightenment, freedom is emptiness, freedom is non-specific, unconditional, etc., and that happened to me at 23, I'm also saying that every child, and we've all been children, every child is free. It's born free. Yes, it's got a genetic code. Yes, it's got immediate environmental conditioning as soon as it's born. But you could say, in a sense, it's immune from that. For a certain period of time in the development of the child, in its brain and consciousness, it's free of that. And I do have an experience of being about 2 years old where I actually felt that I was in this special light, and I refer to that as the divine child. In other words, the divine presence of the numinous. So when these people go into peak experience, playing the piano, that you might say they enter the numinous field. They enter the numinous field. So you could say around each person is a kind of aura of presence. So you could say we're all born with a kind of aura of presence. And I would say that is a kind of threshold of enlightenment. And we all live in that. And that's why the Zen people say, you just clear away the dross, the dust from the mirror, and everything's crystal clear, that you can see yourself in reality, as it were. You wiped away the conditioning and you have a mirror-like wisdom. So if the child is actually enlightened and it's in freedom, then I would say that the threshold is between enlightenment and consciousness. So when it's developing a consciousness and it's kind of incarnating as an identity, as an ego in the body, in the environment, especially in the family, so it becomes an identity to the other people in the family. It's the child, and then it takes on its character, its personality, etc. So you might say that as it loses consciousness of its enlightenment, but in a way that's not the right way to, it's not losing consciousness of enlightenment, because enlightenment has nothing to do with consciousness, just like the body could be quite separate from consciousness. So I'm saying that it's in a state of freedom, then you could say gradually it's in a state of bondage. I'm not giving that a negative. I'm not just saying, human beings living in the world is a kind of purely negative thing, like we're slaves chained to the tree or something. No, I'm not saying it in such a kind of cynical way, but I'm simply trying to see, really define what freedom is. So they're in an enlightened state, they're free running about, and they incarnate, as it were, because I'm not saying where the self comes from. I think it comes from the one in another dimension, but I'm not saying at the moment where the self comes from. I'm just saying that the self incarnates, it's in a state of freedom, enlightenment. And as it incarnates as an identity and is conditioned by society, the environment, the family and the school, so it's in the body, it has a consciousness, it has a memory, it's forming an identity, it's forming a dominant identity, which is the ego, because I don't see the ego as actually a real thing in itself. It's simply the dominant identity that is the child, or the brother, or the sister, and then it becomes the student type of thing. And I'm saying between enlightenment and consciousness, it is a kind of threshold, like an aura, like a threshold. And that's where the numinous is. I think the numinous is. So if you're listening to music and you're enjoying it, and it touches you at a deeper level, I would say you're entering the threshold of the numinous, which is the divine presence. So it's a spiritual presence. And you might see that as you're walking along the river, or you might see that when you go in an art gallery or something like that, or you're with another person, you're feeling really good with the other person. Just because you experience a peak experience, the numinous, the threshold, the aura, as it were, of the divine presence, that in itself doesn't guarantee that you'll enter enlightenment. So I'm pretty sure that people that go into a Zen monastery and they aspire to become enlightened, because why would they go in? They go in there for that reason. That's the reason they go in there. You go in a cinema to watch a film, don't you? So I'm not sure whether they all satisfactorily achieve enlightenment. I think they probably have moments of satori, moments of enlightenment, but I'm not sure that there's a guarantee that they're come out fully enlightened, like the Buddha. And the Zen poets have a way of saying that, in a sense that when a Zen person feels they've mastered all they can in the monastery, they leave it. And if they write their haiku or their poems, they say, there is no Zen, there is no Buddha, there is no meditation, there is no posture. So really they're kind of negating any association to Buddhism, any association to the temple, any association to spirituality. They're just saying they're living in a house in the mountains by the monastery, and they're just a person. They're just living there, and they're just a person. And the assumption is they're enlightened. The assumption is they're enlightened. But to the world around them, the people around them, they're not a master, they're not Zen, they're not a Buddhist, they're just a person. And they don't tell anybody, and so nobody knows. So what influence they have on other people, I haven't read anything said about that. I mean, if you read the life of Jesus, and it says that he had all these powers and healing, and that he could do all these extraordinary things. But the people that wrote that down, they had a motive for writing that down, because there's no record of Jesus. So why did those people write that down? That he was a healer? Because at that time there were lots of people like that. Just like there's lots of mediums and lots of gurus that can have all these powers. And so in those days, I mean, there are loads of people like sorcerers and people like that around. But I'm just wondering why they attach such importance to Jesus in that way. Why would they do that? When in Zen, they come out and they negate the whole system. Because they negate the system of knowledge, which is consciousness. They negate consciousness in that sense. And the Zen and the Buddha and the meditation, they're all aspects of consciousness. So I'm quite interested in the threshold experience. So each human being through their life experiences the numinous threshold of the divine presence. But in the West, people wouldn't define it that way. They wouldn't talk about it in that particular way, unless you're interested in the occult or magic or something like that. Guardian of the threshold. So it's like an indicator, it's like a sign, or a revelation or something that tells you that such a thing is possible. And, if you're going along a road and you're coming into new territory, that's like a border of another country, isn't it? And, you see a signpost, Land of the Dead or something, or No Man's Land, or Twilight Zone, or what I call a Gothic hinterland. that was how I felt when I had my awakening. It first of all was very, very numinous, and there was like a threshold, and there was a kind of aura about everything. Everything around me had that kind of numinous presence. The whole world was like that. But at that exact moment, I didn't feel free at that exact moment. It was almost like, it's like someone turning down the lights or turning up the lights. It's say you're looking at a painting and someone turns down the light, and of course you can't see the painting as clearly, or they turn up the light and you can see it more clearly. It's that kind of twilight zone. So for me, the world around me certainly wasn't like it was before. But I didn't know how, at the time, I didn't know how to describe that. I didn't go around thinking, oh, I'm in this different reality and everything's changed. And no, it was more of a kind of atmosphere, and it like took me over. So, when you fall asleep, you're crossing a threshold, a liminal threshold, and you're in the dream. It's like within a fraction of a second you could be in a dream, as it were, a dream world. And I think it's like that for the child when it grows up. It comes out of the divine presence into consciousness, then starts seeing the world through the lens of its conditioning. So I'm in this state, say, and it's quite strange, quite disturbing, quite uncanny. Numinous. And it took time to adapt to it, maybe days, weeks, months, I don't know, maybe weeks. And then that was over. It's like the threshold experience was over. And it just became natural. And I felt free. But in that state of enlightenment, I didn't divide physical, psychic and spiritual, because I didn't have the terminology. So it was just like one thing to me. It was just like the light went off and the light came on. And as I say, as a child grows up, at some point it crosses a threshold and it's in a kind of consensus reality. It's in the normal consciousness of the people around it. And when you're in this state of enlightenment, say, and you're in this state of freedom, which is unconditional, and you're in the emptiness, then you can't say where you are. I mean, in a dream you can say where you are. If you're in astral travel, you could say something about it, describe it, and have a context. But if you open up a book and every page is blank, that's what it's like in Satori, in emptiness. So what is it that you're enlightened about? If you're not enlightened about the content of consciousness, the content of the physical world and the content of the psychic world, then what are you enlightened about? What does freedom give you? Well, I'm saying that the most important thing per se about being a human being is being free. I mean, on every level of experience, you want to be free to experience. You want to be free to relate. You want to be free to go about the world. And then you have the idea of hierarchy, authority, control, egocentricity, psychopathology, all of that, all these levels of freedom, as it were. So when I became free, as it were, I still had things to do in my consciousness, but I didn't. There was a point where, for I would say a number of months, I wandered around Poughkeepsie, New York, in a state of abandonment or being lost, in the sense of I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to think. I didn't know how to imagine what I was experiencing. I didn't know how to contextualize it. And so it was blank. I mean, I got up in the morning and I literally didn't know what to do. And because I didn't have any framework, I wasn't religious, I dropped out of university, and so I don't know what I was like as a person, but you know, probably if people said to me, well, what are you doing? I say, oh, well, I was in university and I decided to leave university. I don't know what I'm going to be doing at the moment. I mean, that's the kind of state, like I don't know what, you know, I wasn't confused, I wasn't distressed or anything, I just didn't know what I was going to do. So it was like that kind of thing. If you left university anyway, you may not know quite what to do at the beginning. And after a few days a week, you get very nervous, you get very stressed out, because you can't make up your mind and there's no opportunity. And people don't like that kind of insecurity and uncertainty about their future. But in a state of enlightenment, freedom, there's no psychological effect. There was at the beginning, there was that psychological effect, and when I adapted to it, there was no psychological effect. So I didn't get into a confusion in terms of identity. I must be this and I must be that. And this is what a student does, and this is what, you know, so and so happens. So at that time, I didn't know what my future would be, because I didn't even know what a spiritual person was. So I started meeting people that put me on to spirituality, and then I recognized the state I was in was documented as enlightenment, as satori, as freedom or whatever. And then began a new kind of investigation, you know, into spirituality, self-knowledge, you know, the whole field of psychic experience and religious experience and synchronicity, all of those things that took, you know, that took me from 1968, 69 until 2014, when I started to put my experiences in book form, and from 2014 to 2017, getting them ready for publication. 2017, I published the books, and I began to look for interviews. And now, at this moment, I consider that I've stepped out of the field of spirituality, just like the people leave the monastery, they come out of that, and there is no Zen, there is no Buddha. That's my state at the moment. There is no need for me to be identified with anything like that anymore. And so, in a sense, in that form of conditioning, I'm free from that. I'm free from that. But that's not that. But I'm free anyway. I mean, I've always been free anyway. So I've always felt independent, and I could, you might say, at any time, not do what I'm doing. But because I enjoyed the whole journey, the whole quest of self-knowledge and metaphysics and occultism and all of that, I've really enjoyed it. So I've never bothered, I've enjoyed doing it, so it's not been a problem. But now it's over, yeah, good, it's over, and I can be free. But it's interesting that when I didn't know what my future was, because I didn't know what state I was in, but as soon as I realised it was a spiritual process, as it were, not that enlightenment is a process, but I'm saying that for consciousness, there's a metaphysical spiritual process of self-knowledge. Then once I began to read books, and I realised that it was a journey, and that was what I had to do. I mean, we all have to go through the labyrinth. We all have to go through the process of living in the world. And there seems to be no alternative. I mean, if we're incarnated, as it were, as a divine child, and we're in a state of enlightenment, and then we fall, as it were, fall from grace into a physical body and consciousness, then there must be a reason. There must be a reason for that. And you've got karma and various other explanations. And some people think the world is a school of learning. But no doubt about it, I mean, we're born into a consciousness, and that's a field of knowledge. So whether we like it or not, we've got to process thought and knowledge and memory. We've got to do that. I mean, we do that every day. Even if you're enlightened, I mean, right now, I mean, tomorrow and the next day, I'll have to, think about things and do things and be involved in things, whether I like it or not, until I die. I mean, if I'm talking to somebody, then I talk about anything I like to, or listen to music or whatever. I mean, you're still in the process of consciousness. But there's no problem about that. I mean, it doesn't interfere with your freedom. I mean, you can be free and listen to music. You can be free and have a conversation. But this idea of what is a human being, what are we doing here? And I would say again that if we're enlightened as a child, and that's freedom, and we all have moments of freedom, we all see through the veil, as it were, then I would say the overriding parameter of consciousness, the overriding signature, the overriding, you might say, plot line, it is freedom. So you could relativize the whole field of knowledge as a quest for freedom. So if you look at an artist, say, like Pablo Picasso, I often use him because he's the one that influenced me most. So Pablo Picasso is born into a Spanish family. His father is an art teacher at the college, say, Academy of College, and obviously influences Pablo Picasso. And he grows up he seemed to be a genius, and as a teenager he feels he wants to break away from his father and the academy and the kind of conventional way of doing art, and he leaves and goes to Barcelona, mixes with bohemian type of creative bohemian types, finds out that it's best to go to Paris. That's where you'll find some level of notoriety or success in the art world. He goes over there at the age of 19, comes back, goes back again, and by the age of 25 he paints a picture in 1906-7 that revolutionizes the history of art right until today. Just like Einstein revolutionized physics right till today, he produced relativity, that produced quantum physics, and that's what people are into today. So Einstein revolutionized, and they were more or less contemporary people. At that time, it's an extraordinary time, they were more or less contemporary people. So you might say Picasso needed the freedom from his conditioning by his father in the academy and wanted to express himself, find his style, find his freedom, find his inner freedom to be a creative person. And he achieved that. And it seems that all of his life he was in this state of relative freedom within the context of art, so that in his consciousness he was relatively free, as it were. I mean, if you have money in your pocket, you're relatively free from a person that doesn't. It's all relative, I think, in the field of thought and knowledge and experience and so forth. But you could say, like the numinous, that it's a signature. I mean, if freedom is enlightenment, and freedom is the ground, the fundamental ground of the human being, as it were, then you could say that within consciousness, the motive of freedom, the motive towards freedom, which I think is also in the physical universe, where the plant is awakened by the sun, as it were, and it grows towards the sun, and that's its freedom. It needs the light. So I'd say all of relative freedom within consciousness needs that ultimate freedom, that absolute state of freedom. And I'm saying that doesn't lead to freedom. All relative freedom, psychic ability, siddhi powers, peak experience, that won't get you to freedom, but at least you might say in the field of knowledge, in the field of human culture and conditioning, there's always that aspect of freedom. So you could say, is the freedom in enlightenment connected directly with the freedom within consciousness, the relative freedom? So if there's an absolute freedom, and the Buddha achieved that absolute freedom without, you might say, knowing how he did it, it just happened, not knowing how he did it, and can't tell anybody how to do it. And yet he did seem to enlighten other people. He did seem to bring about the enlightenment of other people. So you could say, south to south, one to one, maybe he could commune with another person and actually bring that other person into nirvana with him, as it were. Now, I wouldn't know about that, but it's rather irrelevant to think that an enlightened person can effectively enter the consciousness of another person who's in a relative state of freedom, and you might say extend that freedom into enlightenment, as if there's a connection between consciousness and the spiritual dimension, or the psyche and the spiritual dimension. And I think it's like the physical and the psychic. Yes, you go into a dream, you go into that other level, and maybe it's a distinct universe, it's another universe, but we don't know how that's done. Even though we go to sleep every night, we don't actually know how that's possible, because we don't know what the psyche is, where the dreams are. So I'm saying, if you go into enlightenment, if the Buddha related to somebody and that person went into enlightenment, it's not, I don't think it's a causal thing. It's not like Buddha's enlightenment caused that to happen to the other person. So it might be that the enlightenment, nirvana, has a mind of its own, because it's referred to as the one mind. So you could say the enlightened mind, nirvana, the actual nirvana, can bring a person out of their consciousness. Now, if you're in a Zen monastery, you have a moment of enlightenment, so you're sitting looking out of the window, and suddenly, it's raining or something, and somehow that precipitates a moment of enlightenment, then in a way it's showing that the veil is very thin, and you could be in that enlightened state, in that free state. So you could say that the divine presence, the divine presence, the threshold, the numinous, the veil, as it were, is very thin between waking and sleeping, for example, and that I would say the relationship between enlightenment and consciousness is synchronistic, one-to-one. It's a synchronicity between the one and oneself. So it's yourself that's liberated, as it were. Not consciousness, not identity, ego, but it's yourself that's liberated, and yourself, in essence, is already enlightened. So you could say that that moment of enlightenment is really to do with yourself being in enlightenment, but not knowing you were enlightened. So the Zen say the most natural thing in the world is enlightenment, is freedom, is nirvana, is satori, the most natural thing. That's your original face. So if you look at the child as hypothetically having the original face, like the beautiful original face of a human being, and that's always in you, that means the divine presence, it is all pervasive in the universe and in the psyche. So the one enfolds all of reality on any dimension, any level, any universe. It's always ever present. So you could say that the enlightenment of the Buddha that's the Buddha, say the Buddha in enlightenment, corresponds with your own enlightenment that you're unconscious of. You don't know that. You know, you're in a Zen monastery, you're sitting in meditation, so-called, and then you have this moment of enlightenment. Then you could say that mind, that one, which is everywhere, that one, you know, the light, the clear light of the one mind, the light went on of its own, of its own. And you could say, well, what's the relationship to the person meditating in their consciousness? I am a Zen monk. My identity, my ego is a Zen monk. I'm in the monastery to be enlightened. And somehow, maybe not all of them very much, but say somehow certain of those monks do become enlightened and maybe eventually leave the monastery, and they are in, you know, maybe they're in enlightenment for long periods of time, consciously. So, if there's no cause between, say, the Buddha's enlightenment and the person that he's in relationship to, one-to-one, self-to-self, is suddenly enlightened, and there's no cause, and I'm saying that's a communion, that's a synchronicity, then you could say, why? I mean, why is that? I mean, in Buddhism, they'd bring in the idea of karma and say, well, you've lived all these lives and you've developed yourself, and now you're ready to be enlightened, and that moment of enlightenment is due to all the work you've done. So you could say when the Zen monk goes in a monastery, he works and works and works at meditation, and then the light goes on. I mean, I'm not so sure about that, because I'm not so sure that any form of work in your consciousness actually brings that about. Because for me, when it happened to me, I'd never read any books on any subject to do with religion, spirituality, and I wasn't brought up religious, and it happened to me without anything. And I certainly don't have any sense that I've lived other lives and I've worked towards this point of enlightenment, and I don't feel that at all, not at all. I'm not saying that I haven't lived before, and I've had some suggestions that I've lived in other dimensions, other levels, but I wouldn't say absolute proof, but I've had indications. So if you say the absolute space of reality, and I'm saying the absolute ground and space of reality using the word space, if the absolute space is the one, and the one is enlightenment, and the one is self, and the one is freedom, then that potential is everywhere, and it's informing the universe as a whole, it's informing thought, it's informing psyche. So everything, you could say, is living within that freedom to some degree, which is relative, and then there's the absolute freedom. So it's absolute freedom, and it's enfolding what we call reality. That means any dimension, any universe, any human being, any intelligent being. And the light could go on at any moment. Why, we don't know. Say why, we don't know. But everything's predicated on that absolute principle of enlightenment, of freedom. So the Buddhists say everybody's evolving into a Buddha. And they believe that the whole universe, the whole structure of reality is evolving into the Buddha, even animals. I don't know anything about that. But you could say in a population, why are there only a few geniuses who paint great pictures, produce great music? Why are there apparently only a few geniuses? When I think everybody is born with an innate, inborn genius, as the Greeks would say, and they call it the spiritual genius, actually. And that means everybody's got the capacity to be creative, and I feel everybody's got the capacity to be enlightened because they're a self. And I believe self is one, self is enlightened anyway. And the ego takes over in the child, and it obfuscates, it clouds, it veils that from the child. So when the child grows up, it just more or less forgets, because it didn't remember that it was enlightened, because there's no memory there. There's no identity, there's no consciousness. So you can't remember, the child can't remember that it was enlightened in that sense. But I do look back at 2 years old and say, I do remember like there was a light, and I felt, that was like an enlightenment. So I do have that memory of that. But I'm saying as a child growing up, I didn't know that. I didn't know I was losing my freedom, as it were. So if freedom is synonymous with the one, with an enlightenment, and I'm saying the self is natural ground, natural place, natural home, as it were, is freedom, is enlightenment, but it's not aware of that. I'm not saying it's forgotten that, because he didn't remember it, because it wasn't in consciousness. So I'm saying that certain sacred texts indicate that it's possible, that there is this thing called freedom, but in the West certainly we don't know about that. We don't even regard that as a possibility in many respects. So that tradition, that wisdom tradition, is almost negligible in the West. And people that go to church are just carrying out some kind of belief system and dogma and ritual. So they don't necessarily really understand it properly. It's just called God or something. So if somebody like Buddha says, there is a fact called enlightenment, and the people around him trust him because they're his friends and his family, and then he turns on, as it were, or something happens to one of his family and one of his friends, and they become enlightened, then you might say, at least that tradition is keeping alive the idea that there is freedom. And I think each person essentially, naturally wants freedom, but we only know it in a relative sense: more money, better opportunity, being creative, etc., peak experience, city powers and all that, relative freedom. And people sit all day in meditation, all the people trying to meditate and connect with that freedom, and I'm saying it's not possible. That's why you have to, like Buddha, he gave up his teachers, he gave up practicing yogic meditation and went back home, as it were, and just didn't know what to do, and then suddenly he was enlightened. Why, we don't know, but he was enlightened. But it's clear that it wasn't necessarily dependent on the specific things he did. Just like me, I never read any of those books, I never practiced anything, I didn't even know about spirituality, and yet that happened to me. But I'm saying is happening to every single child. Therefore it's unconditional. And it is about reconnecting with yourself, as it were. It's almost like, the ego clouds the real nature of the human being as being a self. And we become identified with being the child, the brother, sister, father, mother, student, professional, lawyer, priest, king, whatever the thing is. And we forget, I'm not saying we forget about the self, because we don't even realize that the ego is not the self. And these wisdom traditions say, no, you're not your ego identity. You can be your true self, and that true self is enlightened. So it is a journey of self-discovery, of freeing the self from the illusion of identity, as it were. Not that a pianist or a doctor's illusory, of course not. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's nothing wrong with the doctor knowing nothing about enlightenment. I don't think that's a problem. My parents lived and died. They didn't know anything about that. And maybe I could have lived my life and not even bothered with it. It doesn't really make any difference to me personally. So yes, I think there's no way you can be on this planet that isn't an opening into enlightenment, and no matter who you are, what you're doing, enlightenment is as much available to you, whoever you are, as anybody else. Whether you're in a Zen monastery or you're working wherever, in the park or something, doesn't make any difference, I don't think. So if you enjoy reading sacred texts, studying occultism, so be it. That's what you want to do. But I don't think that's guarantee that you're going to find enlightenment and somebody else isn't, because they're leading a fairly normal life. Because I've actually met somebody that I consider to have been enlightened. I'm not saying they were a Buddha, but certainly they were enlightened and very wise, and they'd never read any books whatsoever. So they're just like me at the age of 23. And so I met a very old man, and in the Jungian tradition, he would be the archetype of the wise old man. And I just met him, and he did have a great effect in my narrative, in my journey right here in Colchester. But all I'm saying is that don't look down on other people. Don't compare and judge other people and accuse the world of this and that, and polarize religion and science. Religion is just as deceptive as science. Religion is just as limited as science. They're doing different things. Of course, there are very cynical people in science that put down religion, and vice versa. They both play the superior-inferior game. That shouldn't bother you. You do what you do, get on with what you do.